the Gentiles, by which he means people who don't know Jesus Christ. You are not to live the same life that they live. But here's why. It's not because God is a taskmaster. It's not because Paul is a moral policeman. There is a reason why. And we find this as we look into verses 22 through 24. So let's look first at verse 22. You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. Paul talks here about former way of life. The way that you lived before you came to know Jesus Christ. The way that you lived before you came to know the salvation that is ours through God's grace to us in Jesus Christ. And he calls this the old self. The self that used to exist. The self that used to dominate. The self that used to be in control of our lives. The old self in Paul's theology is a description of the human being in rebellion against God. Humanity in our desire to be Lord of our own life. And when the Bible talks about this, when Paul talks about the old self, the result of the old self is always corruption. And by corruption, what Paul means here is death. The old self is the dead self. Physically still living, but spiritually dead. Because we have been separated from God. The old self is the self that is dead. And what the old self does is it corrupts us. Because what the old self does is it takes us away from God. It takes us away from the life that is ours in God. It takes our desires and it directs them towards ends that are different from the ends that God has for us. It takes our hearts and it points our hearts in the direction of things that take us away from God. And when the Bible talks about being dead, it doesn't talk primarily about physical death. It talks about spiritual death. And when the Bible talks about spiritual death, it defines that as being separated from God. The old self is the self that is separated from God. The self whose desires are corrupting us, as it says in verse 22. Being corrupted by its deceitful desires. This is Paul's description of humanity in our condition of being in rebellion against God, of being separated from Him. So Paul writes to the Ephesians, put off the old self. Put off the old self. Don't live according to the desires of the old self. Understand that those desires will corrupt. That those desires will destroy. That through those desires, death enters the system. And he says, in verses 23 and 24, he says, the result of this, putting off the old self, is to be made new in the attitudes of your minds. And I want you to notice something on that. To be made new is passive. He doesn't say, make yourselves new, right? He says, be made new. We are not the primary actors in being made new. God is the only one who can make us new. God is the only one who can enter into our lives and transform our life. It is not up to us to transform our lives. It is not up to us to look at this list of what Paul is calling the church to do and to say, okay, if I do all of these things, then I will be made new. That's not the way that being made new works. Paul's not saying here, all right, I am putting out for you a list of things you have to do. And if you do these things, if you behave appropriately, if you behave the way that I'm calling you to behave, then you'll be made new. That's not what Paul is saying here. We do not make ourselves new. We are made new. Amen. Then he goes on to say this. In verse 24, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness, which is something that we can never attain through our own behaviors. To be made, let's see what it says, to be made, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. The only one who can do that is God himself. Notice again that it doesn't say create yourselves to be like God by behaving in particular ways. It says created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Who's the one here who's doing the creating? It's God. God is the one who does the creating. God is the one who does the renewing. God is the one who does the remaking, so that we can experience his true righteousness and his true holiness. See, this is not Paul being the moral police, sending out to the Ephesians a list of all the stuff that they have to do in order to behave appropriately so that God won't smite them. What Paul is doing here is he's saying to them that God is at work in you. And what you see here listed of how you are to conduct yourselves, it is not what you must do in order to become new. It's what God is doing in you in order to make you new. And this is the result. The result is that you will live a different life. The result is that you will live a life that is different from the Gentiles. The result is that you will live a life that is different from your old life. The result is that the Spirit of God will be at work in you, not just you as an individual, in you as a community, renewing, reshaping, remaking your way of life. Remaking each one, and therefore remaking your community. See, Paul focuses on the conduct of the church, not because he's looking for ways that he can slap their wrist. Not because he's wanting to put behavioral burdens upon them because he gets giddy and delightful at sitting above them as a moral judge. Paul is writing about the conduct of the church because he longs for them. He longs for them to know the joy of God's renewing grace in our lives. He longs for them to experience the goodness of God's purifying grace that comes into our lives in which death has entered into the system. And God makes us new. He longs for them to know the grace of being made new by God, and therefore to be a church that can show the world the heart of God, the kindness of God, the goodness of God, the mercy of God, the holiness and righteousness of God. Amen. So what's our role? What's our part in this? We do have a role to play. We do have a part to play. We are not the ones who create our new selves, but we do have a role to play. We do have a part to play. And the first thing that we must do is we must acknowledge our need for God's grace. We have to recognize that our condition is dire. That our need is acute. So the gospel teaches us that we, due to our resistance to God, due to our desire to be our own gods, due to our desire to be in charge of our own lives, we have become corrupted. Death has entered this system. The gospel teaches us that the human soul in rebellion against God is like a water tank in the attic in our flat haven. Death has entered the system. And the system has been corrupted. This can't be fixed by running a little water through the system. This can't be fixed by changing up our behaviors a little bit. This can't be fixed by our own moral energies to try to improve ourselves. This can only be fixed by a work of a master craftsman to come in and entirely renew the system. This can only be fixed by taking out the old and replacing it with the new. This is what Paul is saying about us. He's saying that the old is corrupted. He doesn't say this to run people down and to burden us with guilt. He says this because the old is death, and he wants us to know and to experience life. That's why Paul says this. That's why Paul diagnoses the human condition. And he doesn't flinch when he diagnoses the human condition. He tells it like it is. But he tells it like it is because he knows that what it is not what it could be. What it is not what it ought to be. What it is not what God created us to be. Paul knows that human condition can't be fixed through a little behavior modification. The system has to be cleansed. The system has to be remade. The system has to be remade. To receive this cleansing, you must acknowledge our need. Amen. I don't like to acknowledge my need. I like to think that I'm not that addiction. I like to think that my situation's not nearly as dire as some other people's situation. Paul says what Jesus says, what the testimony of the Scriptures say, is that every human being, whether we think it or not, is in a dire condition. Because we have left the God of life. And we have chosen to pursue our own gods. And that has brought us to death. The gospel is good news. And it's good news because it accurately expresses our need and then tells us exactly how God has met that need for us. It frees us from having to meet our own need. It frees us from having to engage in behavior modification to try to please God. It takes the burden entirely off of our shoulders because the burden was placed entirely on Jesus Christ's shoulders. As he bore our sin to the cross, as his body was broken, as his blood was spilled, through him we can be remade. But to do this, we have to acknowledge our need. We have to give up all of our attempts at fixing the system ourselves and entrust ourselves completely to what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen. In just a moment, we invite Pastor Dan up. He's going to sing a song. The words will be up on the screen. But we just encourage you to sit and to listen, to read. The words that are there, the song that we're singing, talk about the work that God has done for us in Jesus Christ. And It's a song that I hope will prepare our hearts as we come to the communion table. As we come to remember, as we come to celebrate, as we come once again to remind ourselves that through the Lamb of God, through Jesus Christ, our sins have been forgiven. And through the Lamb of cross, through the Lamb of Jesus Christ, through the blood of the cross, we can be remade. So I want to encourage you just to take this next few minutes, as Pastor Dan sings, just to quiet your heart. Prepare yourself for the time that we have at the communion table. What we do at the communion table is to remember Jesus' body and blood that were broken for us. We have an open communion table here, which means anyone who is a follower of Jesus Christ is free to take the communion. After the song, the plates will be passed where you are. Just as it comes by, take a piece of the bread, and then a moment after that, take the cup. And after a little while, we will all partake together as we remember the Lamb who was slain, that we everything that's going on in the life of our church that is coming up is on the front of the worship folder each week. I particularly want to draw attention to the top item there, the Town Hall on Social Justice and Racial Reconciliation that we're going to be hosting here at Central October 28th and 29th. Pastor Troy is going to be hosting that. We're opening up our doors to folks from the community to come in and have some time for hearing some people who are doing some thinking and who are engaged in the conversation around social justice and racial reconciliation. We're going to have some time for us to hear from folks, for us to interact with each other, and I just want to encourage the church to be a part of this. And there's a particular way you can be a part of this. If you look actually on the inside folder of the worship folder down at the bottom, Pastor Troy is going to be hosting this coming week a number of discussion groups, some workshops to kind of teach us about what's going on in the neighborhood and how we can be engaged in the neighborhood. So you see the dates there. They're coming up this week, October 5th at 2 and 4, and October 6th at 6 p.m. And then a little bit later on in the month, and you'll hear more about this, we're going to have opportunities for us as a church to go out into the community and engage with the community around us. So just wanted to bring your attention to that. If you have any questions on that, you can ask Pastor Troy, the staff, really, but we'll probably just tell you to go talk to Pastor Troy, so you might want to cut out the middleman and go straight to him. Kids, it's a communion Sunday, so we're not going out for children's church today, so we'll ask you to stay put here. When Mindy and I first moved over to England, the first year that we lived there, we lived in a house that was a Victorian house. It was built around 1860 or so, which over there is kind of a new build. Over here, that you just don't find many houses like that around anymore. It was a house that was kind of old and a little bit creaky. You'd walk up the stairs, and the stairs were very squeaky. There was peeling paint. There was a lot of, shall we say, charm, a lot of character in the house. The house had been divided into 4 different apartments, and Mindy and I were on the second level and then the attic. Our apartment kind of was a 2-story apartment, second level and in the attic. And when you live in a house like this, over time you just kind of get used to the quirks, right? You get used to the odd things that happen in an older house, and after a while, you think maybe we should call about getting this thing fixed, or maybe we should call about getting that thing fixed. And then after a while, you just realize it's just everything needs to be fixed, and there's no point. And so let's just not call. Let's just learn to love the place. And we did. We learned to love the house. But after a while of getting used to it, there might be some things that you overlook that maybe you shouldn't overlook. And this happened a few months into our time living in this house when an odd odor started to come in the hot water. Not when you ran the cold water, but when you ran the hot water, there was a bit of an odor that came with it. And so Mindy asked me after a day of this, have you noticed that there's a bit of an odor in the water? And I said, oh yeah, I'm sure it's no big deal. It's one of the quirks, one of the part of the character of the house. There's old pipes. It's an old country. There's stuff that happens. I'm sure it'll go away. I'm sure it's no problem. Well, it didn't go away. And after a couple more days, Mindy said, we need to call the maintenance people from the college to come over here and figure out what's going on. And at that point, it was pungent enough that I agreed, yeah, that probably is what we should do. So we called the college. They sent the guy out. He came in. He ran the water. He confirmed, yes, there's definitely an odd odor here. And so we said, well, what do you think it is? He said, well, let me look around a little bit. So he kind of poked around with the pipes a little bit in the house. And then he went up into the unfinished part of the attic through this little hatch. And he was up there about 10 minutes or so. And he came down, and he had this look of horror on his face. He was white as a sheet. And he said, here's what's going on. See, the way that the water in this place works, the cold water comes in off the pipe from the street, right up into the house. The hot water gets pumped up into a tank in the attic, and then it goes down from that tank into the hot water heater, and then that's what goes into your house. Now that tank has a lid on it, or had a lid on it. At some point in time, that lid got knocked off, and a squirrel put on his little squirrel swimsuit and decided to dive into the water tank in the attic and never got out. And his dead, decaying body was in our hot water supply, creating quite an odor. The maintenance guy, after he told us what happened, looked at us and he said, don't use the water. To which I responded, no kidding. Yeah, I'm just going to make him a cup of tea with the squirrel water. Don't use the water, he said, because this needs a total overhaul. This isn't something that we're just going to fix by running some more water through this system. This system needs a complete overhaul. The tank will need to be completely replaced. The spigots and the faucets will have to be completely replaced. The system is going to have to be totally cleansed. The system is going to have to be totally remade. The system is going to have to be totally made new. Because the system had been corrupted. Because death had entered into the system. We come this morning to Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verses 17 through 32. We come to this passage as we're following along with Paul's letter to the Ephesians, as he's writing to them about who they are. He's writing to them about the church. He's been painting this picture of the church we've seen over the last 3 weeks. He's been telling them how important the church is in the mission of God. That the church is the very mystery of the universe. That the church is what makes sense of what God is doing in the universe as he is gathering a people to himself. He's saying to the church in Ephesus, you are this people. You are part of this community that God is building. And then over the last couple weeks, we've seen Paul talking to them about how important it is for them as the church to live their life in a way that is worthy of Jesus Christ, because the church is the means by which people in the world see the heart of God. The church is the means by which people in the world will see the character of God. Now, oftentimes, the church demonstrates to the world something other than the heart of God. All too often, the church has shown to the world the opposite of the heart of God. And so Paul has this deep longing in his heart for the church to be a church, as we looked at last week, that is mature, a church that is healthy, a church that truly demonstrates to the world the love of God and the grace that is ours in Jesus Christ. As we come to Ephesians 4 this morning, we come to a passage in which Paul now is starting to talk about the conduct of the church. What it means for us as the church to live a life that is worthy of Christ. Getting more specific now as he moves into this section in the letter. And he's focusing us here as he begins this section on our need for cleansing. On our need for being remade. Our need for being set free from corruption. And so as we come to Ephesians 4 this morning, I just want to ask you, are you in need of the cleansing work of God in your life? Are you in need for the work that only God can do to purify and make you new? I want to ask if you would please to stand as I read Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 32. Where Paul writes this: "So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Do not give the devil a foothold. Those who have been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you."
Amen.
Our Father, we thank you for your word. We pray that you use it in our lives now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
You may be seated. So we come to this passage. I think there's a real danger in the potential of misunderstanding what's going on in a passage like this. It might be that as I read this passage, you were thinking to yourself, okay, here comes the real Paul. Right? He's been talking about all this good stuff in the past. He's been talking about all that God has done for us. He's been talking about what it means for us to be in Jesus. He's been talking about the church. But now the real heart of Paul comes out. The real heart of Paul, which is the Paul who wants to be a moral policeman in our lives. The Paul who wants to create a list of rules for us that we have to obey. The Paul who likes to snoop around in people's lives and who wants to make sure that everyone is behaving in a particular way. The judgmental Paul. The Paul who lays down behavioral burdens on people's backs. The Paul who's running people down, rubbing their noses in their failures, rejoicing in the sinfulness of humanity. In verses 17 and 18, he says, I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. This is some harsh sounding stuff. And Paul is kind of laying this out there, and he's saying, you are not to behave like this. And I think there's a real danger here when we come to a passage like this, to misunderstand what's going on. And unfortunately, I think for many in the church, for many outside of the church, our vision of what Christianity is has often been formed by passages like this and misunderstandings of what's going on in passages like this. I think for many people, this is what they think Christianity is. People who grew up in the church and have felt this behavioral burden that they have received by being in church. This idea that Christianity is a set of religious rules. And we've got to keep these rules. And these rules get laid upon our shoulders and they become a burdensome thing to us. And I think there are many people who didn't grow up in the church, but their vision of the church is that the church is the place where you go to have people who will sit in judgment over you. And they have their list of rules, and if you don't live up to their list of rules, then you're going to be someone who is rejected by the church. And undoubtedly, many of us have stories of experiences like this with the church. And the greatest tragedy of this is that for so many people, this shapes their image of God. This shapes their image of who God is, that they read a passage like this and other passages and then think, well, this must reflect who God is. This is His Word, so God must be a judge who seeks to run us down in our sin. God must be a taskmaster who holds us up to an impossible standard and then delights in judging us when we don't meet that standard. Passages like this one have shaped a view of God in so many people's minds that reflect an image of God being this rule maker who demands that we keep the rules in order to stay out of trouble. And maybe we get into a situation in which we find ourselves getting a vision of God, which is, okay, God, if you make the rules, then I'll keep the rules, and as long as I keep the rules, then you have to be kind to me. You have to be good to me. You have to give me what I want. And we get into this exchange relationship with God, in which you're the rule maker, I'll keep the rules, but as long as I do, then you got to give me what I want. Which is so foreign to what's going on in the Scriptures. And is so foreign to what's going on in this passage. And it's incredibly important for us to understand what it is that is going on. Why Paul is saying these things to the church. Why he is encouraging them in their conduct. Why he is saying to them, these are ways you ought to act as followers of Jesus Christ. But it's so important for us to understand why he is doing this. And to do that, I want to turn to verses 20 to 24. I'm just going to read those, and we're really going to kind of focus in on verses 22 to 24 this morning. So verses 20 to 24 says this, "That, however, is not the way you learned when you heard about Christ, and were taught in Him, in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus." Then he says this, "You were taught, with regard to your former way of life, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desire, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness." Paul is saying to them, you are not to be